Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to assemble or attach the shocks, the rear shocks that we put back together in, I think it was a previous video, and then we're going to move on to mounting the front forks into the triple tree. And depending on how our time ends up, we might move on to some other things. If not, that will be it for today's video. But we're going to start with the rear shocks. So let's go over to the bike, reposition the camera, and we'll get on with it. This is a very simple operation. Basic setup. I removed the strut. Remember in a previous video I mounted these two. There's one over here on the left. This is the right side, temporary strut. I installed those struts when I mounted the swing arm a few videos back now. So obviously I have to remove those as I go to install the shocks or mount the shocks. Anti-seize compound, that will go on the stems right here, the mounting points for the shocks. Not absolutely necessary, but it will help that bushing rotate and keep it free. 17 millimeter wrench or socket right here. A couple pieces of plastic to protect the finish on the new hardware. I'll come back to that in a minute. Some rags, or paper towel in this case, to wipe my hands on because that anti-seize tends to get all over everything. All new hardware on the top and bottom. Hardware meaning washers and dome nuts from Suzuki. You can still get that available. You will note here on this top mount right here I'm pointing to that the powder was a little thick, and when I went to do a test fit of the shock, it didn't really want to go over that thick powder, so I just took some emery paper and abraded it enough to clean it up to bare steel. It's pretty common with powder coating, by the way. I chased these threads, for the dome nuts. I chased these threads top and bottom as well, only because, again, powder tends to build up. Depending on the applicator and how heavy they go with it, sometimes you have to spend a lot of time cleaning up your threads, and I did have to spend quite a bit of time on these threads. The bottom mount, I did not have to remove most of the powder. I just touched it up. Again, this top mount here is the OEM that I talked about in the previous video when I assembled the shocks. The bottom here is the aftermarket, and that fit okay over the powder. Again, I just smoothed it off just a little bit. So what we're going to do here now is just remove the hardware. On the top there are two washers. On the outside there's one on the inside per the diagram, parts diagram, and in fact that's how they came about, or apart rather. And on the bottom there's just the one washer and the dome nut. So I'm going to put a little anti-seize on the stems just to make it a little easier for the shock to rotate. Spread it around a little bit with my fingers. You don't need a lot, just a little bit. Now you see why I need to use or have the paper towel handy, wipe my hands off. So with this top inner washer in place, which is different than the outer washer, it's just a matter now of mounting the shock. Make sure you mount it with this. This is for, you put a rod in there, an adjuster, when you need to adjust those shocks. So you typically would want that pointing out like that. And we will pull. I'm going to have to remove this other strut a second here, I see, to pull like that, the shock up, or the swing arm up enough to be able to mount it. And again, I'm going to put just a little touch of anti-seize there. And then we're going to add the nuts. Same thing on the top. And again, there are two washers in this case. They are identical, but they're different from the inner washer. Now we're going to just snug those up. Now the little plastic piece, and I've talked about these in previous videos, but I do get asked about it from time to time. I just cut these out of any thin piece of plastic. It can be a plastic shopping bag, it can be a parts bag, whatever works for you. The reason I use this is I want to protect this zinc. These are new dome nuts, and I want to protect the zinc as much as I can and not put tool marks. Again, I'm just snugging that up just a little bit. And the same thing on the bottom. And just snug them good and tight. And again, note that the adjuster is pointing out, and it will rotate around like this if I wish to adjust the tension on the shocks. So now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Duplication, what we just did, again, I have the inner washer already installed on the top. It only goes on the top. Little anti-seize for the shocks, like that. There's our shock. Again, this adjuster will fit out facing me, and like that. Let's touch more anti-seize to the threads. And then we're going to go ahead and install the hardware, 2 washers, 1 dome nut at the top, and 1 washer and 1 dome nut on the bottom. And we'll be snugged up. You can see the piece of plastic inside there. And voila, the rear shocks are mounted, so most of the swing arm is complete, except of course installing the wheel and chain guard, etc. But we got it fundamentally mounted right now, so that's going to be it for that part of the project. What we're going to move on to next is mounting the front fork tube. Before we can install the fork tubes and tighten up the pinch bolts, which go right here, we have to remove the powder coat that build up on the inside here, and the clearance is tight enough that the fork tubes will not fit through here without removing the powder coating. I already did a test fit. Again, it's very common for that to happen, that build up of powder coating in this inner surface here, so that needs to be removed. And there's a couple of ways you can do it, and in fact there's many ways you can do it. You could use a drum sander such as this on a die grinder and braid it away like this, running it up and down with a die grinder. You could make something like this with a sandpaper with probably a bolt or something similar and clean the powder coating out that way. What I chose to do was use these 2 tools in a Dremel. I use this little drum here, the sanding drum. You can see it's already been used to do the initial cleaning of the inside, and then I finish polishing it with this sanding, what they call a puff, P-U-F-F. This is a sanding puff. Before I did that, and I did a test run on this tube right here, you can see it's the powder's already removed. On both the top and the bottom surface here, I put a layer of masking tape, that's the blue. Then on top of that, I put some very heavy, very aggressive duct tape. The reason I did that is to protect this surface, because you inevitably, when you're running your tool, whatever method you use up and down, you will damage or nick that paint if you're not careful. I use the blue duct tape because it's not near as sticky as the duct tape is, and I don't want to run the risk of peeling any paint off when I pull that tape off eventually. So I put a layer of blue masking tape down first, which is not as aggressive in terms of stickiness. Then over the top of that, I put a layer of the duct tape, which is very aggressive terms of stickiness, and that will protect the surface if I make a slip. So you can see here is already done. Now we're going to move over here, and I will demonstrate the technique. I'm not going to show you the entire process. That could probably take 3, 4, 5 minutes, but I will give you a flavor of how I go about doing this, and then we'll go ahead and install the fork tubes. I've got the majority of the powder coating removed. Again, remember, your goal isn't to remove metal, it's to remove the powder coating. Very light touch is all it takes. You don't have to be aggressive with it. You want to be very careful and take your time. So now I'm going to change this tool out, and I'm going to go to that puff that we just talked about right here. And I'm going to basically polish the inside of the tube here. And then we'll be ready to mount the fork tubes. All right, I think we pretty well got it all cleaned up, and you can see actually right there, I think where my puff came up and just snagged the surface of that tape, and that's why we put the tape on there, to protect it. And I think we're good to go, so we can go ahead and remove this tape. See how easy that comes off when you use masking tape? It comes off a whole lot easier than trying to peel that black aggressive duct tape off. So we've got the insides cleaned. Now I'll just clean this up, blow it off a little bit, and get the powder away from there, and as you can see, I have the left fork tube installed. I did that just to work out the procedure a little bit for shooting the video. It's not terribly complicated, but it is one of those assemblies that a third hand or an extra set of hands would really be helpful. But it's really quite a simple assembly. At the top of the fork tube right here, you can see there's a black O-ring gasket that has to be in place, because that will nest against the bottom of this section of the triple tree, and that actually will act as a seal. This style fork tube is held in place in two ways. One, there's a pinch bolt right here I'm pointing to. Here's the one on the left, here's the one on the right, and again there's this bolt that comes down from the top like that and goes into that threaded section right there, and that's why you have to have that gasket, because that pulls that assembly together. The cap right here, which is used for, besides being decorative, there's a reflector, I believe, that threads into this tapped hole right there, and this fits something like that, as you can see, I think, here on the other side. Right there. Now there's supposed to be a gasket underneath that. Right here, I actually made this gasket. I made both of them out of a piece of inner tube, old inner tube. When it came apart, it did have the original factory gaskets, but for the life of me, I can't find them. I know they're around here somewhere. I looked at the photos when I took the bike apart, and I had them, and it looked like just a round piece of rubber gasket. So I just made up a couple from like I said, a piece of inner tube. No doubt, eventually, once I get this together here, probably within a matter of days, I will find the originals, but I'm not going to go back and replace them. This inner tube piece will work just fine. So that fits like that, and then the tube passes up through that. Of course, we have the headlight bracket. Some people call them a headlight ear, that fits in this section right here. And you just have to carefully fit that into place, something like that, as you can see right there. Now what we'll do is we'll just pass this tube up through the bottom section, something like that, and we're just going to work it up. All the way up to the top, and then hold it in place with this bolt. And we have the two tubes in place. Now what I'm going to do is torque this top bolt on each tube and the pinch bolts. There is a torque setting for those. I did put just a touch, by the way, of anti-seize on these bolts. I'm going to go ahead and torque them up, and let me get the book out here and we'll take a look at what the torque setting is specified as. Let's talk about torquing of these bolts. There's 4 bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4, that hold or locate the tubes for the front forks. And then we have the steering stem bolt right here at the top. These all take the same torque settings, believe it or not. And in order to find that, I had to do a little research. This is the Suzuki service manual I've talked about a number of times. It's really a compilation of some different bikes because Suzuki, to my knowledge, did not make a service manual specifically for the TS50 Delta. Anyway, inside of the service manual, I did find this for the TS50. Let's see if I can get that in shot for you. And this does talk about checking the tightness of various fittings. And number 1 and number 3, right over here, you can see that, are the ones in question. And it's 1 and 3, and they talk about checking the tightness of those bolts. Well, it doesn't talk about what the tightness is supposed to be or what the torque is. So in order to find that, I had to go to the Suzuki TS50, which is also in this manual. And I did find the settings for those same fittings. Number 4, I don't know if you can see that or not there. Number 12, hope that's not too much light for you. But in both cases, they call for a 13 to 20 foot-pounds of torque, which actually I think is a little light given the size of those bolts. I did check the standard torque on those, and that's around 30 or 31 foot-pounds. I'm going to go with 13 foot-pounds, which is the low end of that chart we just looked at, primarily because I have anti-seize on these fittings and on these bolts, and that will affect the torque. So the first thing I'm going to do is torque this top nut here, or bolt rather. Swing this out of the way a bit here, this way. I don't know which is better for you, maybe like that. I've got my torque wrench set to 13 foot-pounds, and we're just going to go ahead and snug that bolt up. This is a clicker style torque wrench. And again, you'll note I use plastic to protect the finish on that bolt. Now we need to tighten these 4 bolts to secure the fork tubes in the setup here. Even though I talked a moment ago, based on the torque settings in the service manual, that these bolts are supposed to be at a minimum of 13 foot-pounds also, just like this one was for the steering stem. I'm not going to go to 13 and after considering it a little bit more. I'm concerned about squishing or distorting that rubber O-ring donut gasket we talked about that's at the very top of this fork tube that gets pinched against the bottom edge of this triple tree assembly. I took a look at the parts diagrams for the AS50, which that service manual that I just referenced was based on, and they use a little bit different design. Even though there is a gasket in here, the overall design is different than this fork. And I'm concerned again about distorting that gasket in there too much. So I'm not going to torque these. I'm just going to tighten them using just a basic socket here, and I'm going to go by feel and experience. Again, I want this tight, but I don't want it overly tight, so I'm just going to snug it up by hand. Again, notice the piece of plastic to protect the finish on those nuts, or those bolts rather. Just nice and snug. Now, since this is a restoration, it really doesn't make an awful lot of difference as long as they're tight and they don't leak oil out of the top of the fork tube. If this was a serious rider or competition machine, I would put more research and effort into determining what that torque should be, but right now I'm just snugging them down by hand like you just saw. Now we're going to go ahead and torque these nuts or bolts down. I don't know why I keep calling those nuts, because they're not. Just a reminder, these are the originals. They are no longer, I believe, if I recall, available from Suzuki. These were replated a number of videos ago. Again, using a piece of plastic to protect the finish. I'm just going to torque these now to 13. 1, 2. So the steering assembly now is installed. Front forks. Quite pleased with the way they came out. You might note here, I don't know if you can see that or not. Let me zoom in for you. I don't know how well that comes through on the video, but on each of the stops on each side, I just put some tape to prevent the steering stem as it moves back and forth from banging up the finish of the fresh powder coat. It acts like a little bumper, as you can see there. Protects that paint, that fresh paint. Eventually I might tighten this nut up here, this adjustable nut, and pull that a little tighter against the bearings. It's a little bit, I think, on the loose side right now. I'd like a little more friction on that. I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. That'll come eventually. And of course we'll have to install the steering stem lock, which will fit right in here. That will have to, I think, be re-plated, zinc plated, because the finish isn't the greatest as I recall. I'll have to get out of my parts box and take a look. But basically now the front forks are back together. At this point I could go ahead, if I had them done, and install the wheels, which I don't have done yet. In fact, I don't even have them. I've got to go ahead and order those so we can go ahead and get the tires or the rims relaced, get the hubs. I got to get the hubs painted, etc. So we've got a lot of work to do. That's going to be it for this video today, folks. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.